For the next session, we are going to start looking at data. So even though you're all on mute, I can hear the collective groans from lots of people. But honestly, hopefully after this session, you will realize that data in QI isn't that bad. I'm not necessarily a data person, but I actually quite like data in QI. It makes sense and it's fairly simple. And hopefully you all agree at the end of this session. So we're going to start taking a bit more of a look at the data you have all been collecting through your weekly surveys. Originally, we were thinking of doing this in January when you had a bit more data, but we appreciate that we've been asking you and your teams to collect data for some time now without actually having much to connect it to and connect to why you're doing that. So we've brought forward part of the data bit to today. So the session is split into two parts. So first off, I'm going to take you through why we collect data in QI, why it's important, how we can use it for learning. And then after that, we're going to spend some time thinking about how you might improve your data collection, and hopefully you'll leave with some ideas of your own that you can try out with your teams really soon. So throughout the collaborative so far, the QI coaches have been taking all of your survey responses and putting them into a website called LiveQI, which is an online platform we use for lots of different things. One of them being to upload, display and analyze your data. So this produces a graph called a statistical process control chart, or an SBC chart. And you can see an example of these on the screen now. So these are the SBC charts for each of our 3 outcome measures. And that includes all the data for all the teams on the collaborative. So it's the aggregate data. And then each of your teams will also have your own 3 charts for your own data. But how do you use these charts? And why should you care about them? So we can go to the next slide, please, Emily. So in quality improvement, we are tracking data over time. So you have been collecting data at regular intervals throughout the project. So in the case of this collaborative, through weekly surveys. And collecting real-time data is useful for lots of reasons. And here I want to give you an example of why we're doing this. And why we're not just doing a comparison between your data from the first week of the collaborative and your most recent week's data, for example. So in this slide, you can see a project that was looking at the implementation of a new protocol related to coronary artery bypass graft procedures and its effects on mortality. You don't need to worry too much about that. But in this example, the data is collected at 2 distinct time points, time 1 and time 2. Which you can see there in the 2 bars. And looking at this new data, it looks like the new protocol was a great success and reduced average mortality by a massive 20%. However, if you were to collect data over time instead of just 2 distinct time points, like you are doing in the collaborative, there's actually more you can learn, which might tell a slightly different story. So if you go to the next slide, please, Emily. So here you can see an example for the same project, but if they were collecting data over time. So in this case, they were collecting data over 24 months, which you can see at the bottom on the x-axis. So they were collecting data before that protocol was implemented continuously, and then continued collecting data after that. And so if you look at the full picture by collecting data like this over time, you can actually see that mortality had already started to decrease in the couple of months before the protocol was introduced. And then it also appears that the mortality rates then started to rise again, although not to previous levels. So in this way, collecting data in real time helps us to understand, we can start thinking about what led to that decrease before the protocol was introduced, what was happening at that time, what was happening around the time when the rate started to rise again. And so it just provides you a bit more information that you can use for learning. And essentially just gives us a much richer story. If you go to the next slide, so why use SBC charts and why collect data over time? So it's used to study how a system or process changes over time. They can help us understand when there is something special in your data that you should be paying attention to. So that's called special cause variation. And also what is just normal variation. So changes in the data that are due to regular, natural or ordinary causes, which is called common cause variation. SBC charts are the best tool to help us understand variation in a system or a process, to help us understand if a change idea is actually leading to an improvement, which is really important for the work you're doing, but also whether any improvement has been sustained. So we don't just want you to see sort of a temporary improvement in data, for example. We want to be sure that whatever changes you're making, they're actually sustaining that improvement over time. So on the next slide, you can see a picture of a control chart. Emily, if you can just do a click and then another one. Thank you. So this is what an SBC chart looks like, and that's what you will see when you start to look at your own data on Life QI, which your QI coaches will be able to help you with. So on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis, you have data in some sort of chronological order. So it might be monthly, but in the case of the Enduring Work Collaborative, it's weekly. And then on the vertical axis, the y-axis, you have the measure of interest. So the case of our collaborative, that is the percentage. So for example, for the outcome measure to do with burnout, it's the percentage of people who reported no symptoms of burnout. Through the middle of the chart, you can see the mean, so also known as the average. And then you can probably see that there are also some extra lines going across the chart, in addition to the mean line. And these are the upper and lower control limits. And they help us to understand variation in our data. Within any process, there's going to be some natural variation, and the control limits define the boundaries of expected random variation above or below the mean. In the next slide, so as I mentioned before, SBC charts are really useful for understanding our data in different ways, understanding if the data is showing an improvement, understanding if there is sustained improvement. And the way that you can do this, so the way that you can differentiate between something that is special cause or common cause variation through the 5 rules of a control chart. So they are a shift, a trend, 3 sigma variation, the rule of 2 out of 3, and the rule of 15 or more data points hugging the mean. So we're just going to go through these one by one. So the first one is a shift. So a shift is 8 or more consecutive points, either all above or all below the center line, so which is the mean. So in this case, you can see that they're all below the mean. A shift indicates that there's been a sustained change in your data. And in this case, your mean and control limits, if this happens, so in this example here where they've had a shift, that means that your mean and control limits actually don't reflect your data anymore and would need to be recalculated. And you can see that in this example at the beginning, so where their mean is lower. Earlier on in this project, they had a shift to below the mean, so they've recalculated their new mean because they've had a sustained change, so they can feel confident that that's their new way of working. In the case of a shift, values that fall on the mean don't add to or end a shift. So if you had what looks like a shift, but one of them falls on the mean, you would just skip that value and then carry on counting after that. In the next slide, you can see rule 2, which is a trend. So this one is 6 or more consecutive points, all going up or all going down. So in that first case there in the green circle, you can see a trend going down. And then if you click one more time, Emily, and then they also have a trend that is going up. In the case of a trend, if 2 or more points in a row are the same value, these are known as repeats, and you just ignore the extra repeats and continue counting. On the next slide is rule 3, so 3 sigma violation. So in this one, if you have a data point that exceeds either the upper or lower control limits, this is a demonstration of a special cause, so something in your data that you need to pay attention to. And when this happens, we need to have a think about what might have caused that special variation. You might want to think about if there's anything in particular happening at work or within your team that might help explain it. But you can see examples of 3 sigma violations with the circled dots there in that slide. On the next slide, we have rule 4, which is the rule of 2 out of 3. And this is when you get 2 out of 3 consecutive points in the outer 1/3 of the chart. So if you click again, Emily, you can see towards the end of that data set there, they have 2 data points in a row that are in the outer 1/3 of the chart. The points don't have to be in the same outer 1/3. So one of those points could have been in the upper outer 1/3, and then the next one could have been in the lower outer 1/3. That still would have been a 2 out of 3. They could also have had a data point in between those that wasn't in an outer 1/3, and it would still count as a special cause variation and something that you would want to look at. And then in the next slide is the final rule, rule 5, which is 15 or more data points hugging the mean. So hopefully this is fairly self-explanatory from the chart. So it is 15 or more consecutive data points hugging the center line, so the inner 1/3 of the chart. And so again, if you see this, this is suggestive of special cause variation, so something in your data that you want to pay attention to and think about. So in the next slide, oh, thanks, Emily. So if we go back to the aggregate chart that we were looking at right at the beginning of this slide set, we can try and apply some of those rules to the aggregate data so far. So here you can see the aggregate chart for the outcome measure to do with joy at work. So the percentage of people who've enjoyed being at work on a frequent basis. And so according to the rules of a control chart, in this case, there are no special causes identified in this data. So there isn't really anything that has occurred yet to cause a significant change in the data. But emphasis on yet, because there is still time, we've got plenty of time before the end of the collaborative. In the next slide, we'll see the aggregate chart for the outcome measure to do with burnout. So the percentage of people who experience no symptoms of burnout at work. And here you can see a shift in the data as marked on the chart with the pink dots at the top. I'm not sure if you click again, Emily. No, if we go back again. Through the pink dots at the top there. So as per the rules of a control chart, this would suggest a sustained change. So in this case, a sustained increase in the number of people reporting no symptoms of burnout. However, this one is slightly different on this chart because the shift crosses the time period where the baseline period of data ends and the testing period begins, which you can see in the blue and purple boxes at the top. So the baseline period is something that has been set by our team. So our coaches will have set this period and it marks the point in the collaborative where most teams have collected their baseline data and then started to test change ideas. So essentially the testing period shows when most teams have started testing their ideas, and the assumption is that before that there weren't really any change ideas being tested. So in this case, the shift actually started before most teams started testing any changes, and only 5 points fall above the mean after the end of the baseline period. So by the rules of a control chart, you need 8 or more consecutive points for a shift. So that's not actually enough for a shift in this case. And so this change in the data can't be attributed to change ideas tested by you. If the shift after the baseline, if seen here, if that shift after that baseline ends and continued to 8 or more consecutive points above the mean, that would have shown special cause during the testing phase, and therefore could have been a result of change ideas that you've been testing. And then in the next slide, so this is the aggregate data for the outcome measure to do with recommending your team as a place to work. So the percentage of people who are extremely likely to recommend their team as a place to work. And here you can see a shift in the data below the mean with 8 consecutive points during the testing phase. However, if you click again, oh no, just one more click. There you go. The 5th data point in this shift is on the mean. So we actually skip that one and keep counting. So this gives us 7 consecutive points, which is not a shift. And so in this case, there is no special cause variation during the testing phase for this outcome measure. Even if there had been a shift, you might be thinking that surely that's a bad thing in this case, because it would suggest that the percentage of people rating their team highly has actually fallen. And if that had been the case, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not uncommon in QI in the early stages of data collection, and doesn't necessarily mean something bad. Because data in QI is collected at regular intervals and is usually quite simple to collect, it often provides more accurate data than other methods of data collection. And also in this case, it's taken a few weeks for teams to get used to collecting data, mainly through ImproveWell. So it might have taken up until this point in the collaborative and this point in the chart for us to get accurate data. So if you go to the next slide for me. So just really quickly to summarize, so we collect data over time so that we can see patterns and learn from the data in real time. We use SPC charts to differentiate between common cause variation and special cause variation. There are 5 rules of special cause variation in the control chart. We're particularly interested in shifts because these suggest a sustained change in data. And your QI coach that is working with your team can give you access to your charts and help your team to understand your own data. This was a bit of a whiz through, sort of a data 101, if you like. All the slides will be available on our website, as will a recording of this presentation. So you will be able to have a look at those. But if at any point you do have any questions, you can reach out to your QI coach, who will be happy to help. I think we might be a bit tight for time, so I would say if you do have any questions, put them in the chat, and me or one of the other coaches will get back to you. But for now, if we go on to the next slide. So the beginning part of this presentation was to just start looking at understanding your data, but now we're going to take a step back and look again at data collection. So in order to learn as much as we can from our data, we need to collect enough of it, and we need to collect it consistently. And so for this collaborative, this means getting as many of your team to complete the weekly surveys each and every week. And lots of our teams are still looking at ways they can improve this. And so we're going to spend the rest of this session thinking a bit more about that. So first off, in a second, I'm going to hand over to Rosanna, who's going to tell us a bit about some alternative ways to improve well to collect survey responses that some of the teams on the collaborative have been trying. We're then going to help you share some of ideas your teams have been testing to try and improve response rates to the surveys. And then we'll move into breakout rooms where you'll be sort of creating an action plan to take away from today's session on with an idea of how you can improve your survey responses over the next couple of weeks. So for now, I'm going to hand over to Rosanna.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosanna. I'm a quality improvement coach, and I'm just going to speak very briefly because a couple of the teams that I've been supporting have been collecting data in different ways. All the teams are set up to use ImproveWell either on a mobile phone app or on an internet browser, but some people have found that that doesn't work that well for them. Some staff members don't want to use their personal phone for a work thing. Some people just don't like it. Some people forget to do it. So some teams have been experimenting with other ideas. So one team so far has been using paper surveys. They're a ward-based team, so everybody is on site. And they've just printed off the survey from ImproveWell. They haven't had to make anything special, but going on to ImproveWell on the website, they've then just printed the page, printed lots and lots of copies of it, and collected up those paper surveys every week and just done a quick tally of the surveys and emailed those results to me for me to then put into Life QI. And any team can do the same, just print off the survey from ImproveWell onto paper, hand out the paper surveys to your team, or put them in a staff room or somewhere that's obvious for the team members to just pick up the paper, fill in the 3 quick questions and leave them somewhere obvious. It's still anonymous, and it's still easy for someone to count up. The important thing is just making sure that there's no team members that are doing both Improve Well and the paper surveys, because then their responses would get counted twice. Another team, so the Isle of Wight, have been using Mentimeter. You might be familiar with Mentimeter from our previous learning sets, and we're going to use it shortly. But if we go to the next slide, you can see how they've been using Mentimeter. So they've put the 3 questions from the Improve Well survey onto Mentimeter. And this is what it looks like if you're filling in the survey. And then on the next page, the next slide is what it looks like if you're setting up a survey on Mentimeter. So anyone can just set up their own Mentimeter account for free. And this is where the team have just copied and pasted the questions and responses into Mentimeter. And on the next slide is what the responses look like. So at the moment, I share access to the Mentimeter account for that team, and so I can get the results. But just as easily, you could take the results from the Mentimeter and just email it to your coach. So that's another way of collecting data. We're going to move on to a Mentimeter survey of our own now to share ideas of how you've improved data collection. And this might not be looking at alternatives to Improve Well, but it could be things like reminding teams in your meetings. One of the teams earlier talked about putting time aside in the meetings for everyone to just complete it there and then. But it could also be things like putting up a poster in your staff kitchen to remind people to do it, or checking in supervision if your colleagues have completed it, or there could be lots of different ideas. So we're keen to hear what's working for people. Someone's put in the chat that Improve Well isn't working on your phone. The web app is a good alternative, or what some people have found is that if they uninstall and then reinstall the app, it starts working for them. But we know that Improve Well are working on a fix for that, which should be fixed by later this week. I'll hand back to Matt.
Thanks, Rosanna.